Good evening and welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Ford Presidential Library. We are really delighted to have you here tonight. My name is Elaine Didier, and it's my privilege to serve as the director of both the library here in Ann Arbor and the museum in Grand Rapids. Tonight's program, if you haven't noticed already, is being taped by Michigan Productions for later broadcast on Ann Arbor Cable. When we get to the Q&A session after the program, please go to the microphone at the back of the center aisle so that everyone watching in the future television audience will be able to hear your programs. And now, before we get started, please be sure that your cell phones and other electronic devices are turned off. Tonight's program is brought to you by the National Archives and Records Administration in partnership with the Ford Presidential Foundation. We are very pleased that the Foundation's Executive Director, Joe Calvaruso, is here tonight. With the Foundation's support, we are able to bring you programs of this quality, and we would welcome your becoming a member of Friends of Ford to help these programs coming our way. Before we go into our program, however, you've seen on your seat a press release that came out last Friday announcing some very big news for us, and I would like to invite Joe Calvaruso to the podium to tell you a little bit more about it. Joe?
Thanks, Elaine. It's great to be here, and what a wonderful audience here in Michigan on a nice, beautiful fall evening. Last Friday, as Elaine said, we announced a capital campaign of $15 million to help continue President Ford's legacy. A lot of that money will be to encourage young adults to take a career in public service. $5 million goes to a new student learning center, which we hope to pilot in Grand Rapids and then put on our website, so students throughout the country will be able to learn about public service, President Ford's character, integrity, and the things that he brought to office. We have $1 million allocated to digitize just a small portion of the papers that are here in the archives, so students and adults throughout the world will be able to learn and understand President Ford's legacy and what he left us with. We got $8 million to totally redesign the museum in Grand Rapids for modern technology and things. So when you leave, this is the press release that Elaine was talking about. Feel free to stop, ask me questions. You can go to our website, see me afterwards. Hopefully you'll be encouraged to join in celebrating President Ford's legacy. He turns 100 years old next year, so we're going to be hosting a number of key events in Grand Rapids here in Ann Arbor, talking about his centennial birth year. So thank you for coming on a beautiful Thursday night or Wednesday night in Grand Rapids, and thank you, Elaine, for the time. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Joe. We are very honored to have the level of support we have from the Ford Presidential Foundation. This support has been consistent and, again, makes possible everything we do at both of our sites. So we are thrilled that the foundation is willing to invest the kind of energy that has already gone into the capital campaign. The trustees themselves have already committed to $10 million of that goal. So we're well underway, and it will really make some wonderful things possible at both of our sites. For tonight's program, we have the distinct honor of hosting Sasha Issenberg, an accomplished journalist and author. He will be discussing his newly released book, The Victory Lab, The Secret Science of Winning Campaigns. Now that this election is over, this is a wonderful time for us to take a look back and consider some of the factors behind the outcome. Mr. Issenberg is a graduate of Swarthmore and began following the processes of political influence in the streets of Philadelphia. He further honed his skills covering the 2008 presidential election as a national political reporter in the Washington Bureau of the Boston Globe. He is now a columnist for Slate and the Washington Correspondent for Manacle, where he covers politics, business, diplomacy, and culture. His work has also appeared in the New York Times Magazine, the Washington Monthly, Inc., The Atlantic, and George, where he served as a contributing editor. Sasha Issenberg's first book was a fascinating name, The Sushi Economy, Globalization and the Making of a Modern Delicacy, published in 2007. Maybe we should ask him how he happened to choose that particular topic, for those of us who like sushi. This new book, recently published, that he'll be discussing today, began as an article planned for the New York Times Magazine, and then grew like Topsy into wide-ranging research and interviews that emerged as The Victory Lab. There have been many articles referencing his book throughout the fall, and many more since the election have referenced it, and of course he's had extensive television coverage on a variety of talk shows. In September, the Wall Street Journal featured an essay by Mr. Issenberg titled 5 Ways to Hack Voters' Brains, and I hope that he'll talk about some of those ways tonight. Responses to the book so far have been rave reviews. Nate Cohn of the New Republic states, there are few other books that address the complexities of the political ground game, and those that do are too old to incorporate the rapid changes in campaigning over the past decade. Richard Ben Kramer, author of What It Takes, says of our guest, Sasha Issenberg is our most acute observer of the modern political campaign. With vivid portraiture and crystal clear prose, he takes us beyond the charge and countercharge, the rallies and stump speeches that we've heard so much about, to show us the hidden persuaders. This is the politics you'll never see on the nightly news. And I must say that based on a very fascinating dinner table conversation just now, you're in for a real treat tonight, because those are not just blurbs on the book, it's for real. Will you welcome to the Ford Library, Sasha Issenberg.
Hi, thank you all for coming out. Thanks to the library and for having me, and Foundation for helping to sponsor such a nice program. So we, at dinner, of course I had to nostalgize about past visits to Michigan, and I was thinking back to times I was here in 2008 while a reporter at the Boston Globe, mostly covering McCain. And again, that sort of parade of rallies and speeches, which sort of represent the entirety of my, at least political memories of having been a reporter in this state. And it's a reminder to me so I spent the 2008 cycle as a reporter for the Globe, basically covering campaigns the way that you, I assume, experienced this last one, with a real focus on sort of big events, candidate speeches. The sort of understood mandate for a modern political reporter was to basically stick as close to the candidate as you possibly could. So I flew around with McCain and Obama, and to some degree Hillary. And the goal was always to make sense of what they were saying, where they were saying it, the sort of slight shifts in their language, how what they were saying matched up with what their ads were saying, what their pollsters would tell us about why they were saying it. And all of it seemed to be in the service of trying to distill the election to sort of one big thing. What is that one issue that this is going to be decided on? What is that single sort of defining contrast between the candidates? What is that one state that's going to prove pivotal, or that demographic group that's going to sort of hang in the balance? And I didn't fully appreciate until after that election was over, until 2009, the extent to which I had sort of seen only a very little bit of campaigns and failed to really understand what was going on in them. And that's when I came to fully appreciate the extent to which there was a whole lot else going on, often back at the campaign headquarters, dozens or hundreds of people whose, not only did I not know who they were, I didn't even know that their job descriptions existed in politics. A group of people that I'll very loosely and generously lump together as geeks, who were posing and beginning to answer a bunch of questions that were never kind of part of the language that we as reporters had, or that at least the people we interacted with on campaigns had. And in the broadest sense, they weren't at all interested in finding the one big thing that was going to determine a race, because they actually didn't believe that there was one big thing that would determine a race. But what they did all day was sort of focus on trying to isolate and measure the many, many millions of little things that can determine the outcome of a race. And it marked a sort of dramatically different, so the stuff I was looking at, the sort of rallies and speeches and those big events like debates or conventions, I realized represented only a small share of the sort of levers that these people inside campaigns thought that they had to actually move votes. And as a result, they were concerned about tactics that we in the press corps sort of didn't think of as part of the broader strategic goals of the campaigns. And they thought about the electorate in an entirely different set of terms. And fundamentally, they thought about the challenge of what you do to move a vote as in ways that I couldn't even begin to imagine. And what sustained this were sort of two major innovations that had migrated into politics in the decade or so that I had been covering campaigns, but to which I and basically all my peers in the press corps, and by extension the public, had been almost entirely oblivious. One, moving into politics effectively from the commercial world, from the corporate world, people doing commercial research and consumer marketing, the other from academia and from the social sciences, that fundamentally changed what at least the smartest people in campaigns understood about how to sort of sort through the electorate and actually move votes. And so the book I wrote is sort of the story of those two ultimately intertwined innovations and how they've changed campaigns, and what happened a week ago yesterday more than anything I think affirms the sort of primacy of the sort of new mechanics of actually moving votes in the 21st century, and it's no longer, I think we're starting to sort of come to an acceptance that election wasn't necessarily about one big thing, but that there was one campaign that understood how to isolate the lots of little things and move them in the direction that they wanted. But what had happened in the time that I had been covering campaigns, which is more or less my whole professional life when I wasn't writing about sushi, first of all, was a huge influx of data into the political world from other sources. I'll give you a brief sort of history of what campaigns know about you. There's the information that you put down when you register to vote, which is your name and your address and your age and your gender, and in some places your race and ethnicity, and in some states, not this one, a party registration. And then the history of elections in which you vote, which often includes whether or not you vote in primaries, although that's a peculiar piece of data in the state. But that's ultimately a very limited profile of who you are. Beginning in the sort of 60s and 70s with the first generation of computer punch card technology, it became possible to organize information about how your precinct voted, which gave some sense of the sort of political complexion of your neighborhood. And gradually to do the same thing with census information that offered some ability to sort of sketch the socioeconomic status or household type of your neighborhood. And with that, campaigns could begin to extrapolate things about who you were and how you lived. The big breakthrough in campaigns came after 2000, where people inside the world of politics said, ultimately, that's a fairly limited amount of information about the people that we're trying to reach and persuade and mobilize. And they looked over at the corporate world and realized that companies knew a whole lot more about their customers or potential customers, and that massive databases had been developed initially to credit rating scores, then became useful to direct mail marketers who wanted to figure out if they should send you catalogs, and by charities that would buy lists to go out prospecting for new donors. And this was information that came from a lot of sources, much of it stuff that we sort of give away a little unknowingly, probably when we fill out warranty forms or apply for a sweepstakes or fill out a customer service questionnaire, and you check the box that your household income is in a certain range, or you have 2 children living at home, or you're a college graduate, or you take a certain number of vacations a year. These companies would also go out and they'd buy up lists of magazine subscriptions, or cruise ships would sell lists of their customers. And then they'd go out and they'd collect lots of public records that were maintained locally, but nobody had ever brought together before, like people who had gun licenses or hunting permits or applied for construction permits to put a pool in their backyard. And they collected all this information in data warehouses in the private sector that were useful to companies, because they, if Home Depot wanted to decide where to put a store, they'd go look for people who had pools, or if Cabela's wanted to go figure out where they should send catalogs, they would try to find people who were likely to be hunters. And people in the political world realized, wow, these companies know a lot more about the people they're trying to reach than we do. And so what happened in the first few years of the last decade, 2001, 2002, people who did political data went out and started acquiring this data from commercial data warehouses and linking it up with voter registration records. The other major source of information that campaigns know about you is the stuff that they collect every day over the course of a campaign in seemingly innocuous interactions that you have with volunteers. I have a lot of respect for people who volunteer in campaigns, but to take the unsentimental view, they are unpaid data collectors. And every time somebody calls you during dinner or knocks on your door and says, I just want to ask you a few questions. Do you plan to vote next week? Who do you plan to vote for? What issues do you care about? Each of those becomes a data point, a variable about you. Those are pieces of data that used to get written down on a clipboard, and the clipboard got put in a file cabinet, and the filing cabinet went into the dumpster the day after the election. Now that goes on the clipboard, and the clipboard at some point becomes a data entry project for somebody, and it goes onto a database, and it never disappears. And so what you started to have a decade ago was that campaigns went from having maybe a few dozen data points about you from your voter registration record and the census and how your precinct voted to maybe 1,000 data points about you. And that could be whether or not you had taken a cruise and whether or not you subscribed to Harper's, and whether or not you once checked off a box that said your household income was between $75,000 and $100,000, and whether or not you told a canvasser for John Edwards that global warming was the most important issue to you. And it became possible to run statistical models in which algorithms would look for patterns between the information that's available about every registered voter and what campaigns were learning about public opinion through massive large-scale polls that they were doing. And these aren't just the 700, 800 sample polls that probably drove most of us batty throughout October, but often thousands of people, sometimes tens of thousands of people in the state, so that the sort of subgroup categories that you had were much bigger. So in your normal New York Times or CNN poll of Ohio, half your sample is women, and a fifth of your sample is African American, and a quarter of your sample is rural. But if you want to look at rural African American women, you have like 6 people in your sample, and you can't really learn anything about them. But if you do 10,000 interviews in the state, that number becomes a lot larger, and you can see a whole lot of other patterns. And so what these algorithms would do is they'd weigh the individual influence of each of those 1,000 variables for a voter on predicting the answer to a few questions that mean a lot to campaigns, which is how likely are you to vote, and how likely are you to support my candidate? And then sometimes, how likely are you to be pro-choice or be a gun owner or whatever else they care about? And the result is something that I like to, a set of scores. They're individual level predictions. And I like to think of them as basically credit rating scores for politics. And so in the same way that a financial institution will not sign off on a line of credit for you, until they have a quantitative assessment of your likelihood of paying off a bill on time or defaulting on a loan or running up more than $1,000 of charges in a month, a field organizer in a modern campaign is not going to send somebody to knock on your door or have a brochure sent to you in the mail or have somebody call you without having a probabilistic assessment of your likelihood of going out and casting a ballot already, of already supporting their candidate, of sharing their position on abortion, whatever it is. And what it allows them to do is you come up with these individual level scores, and campaigns can now sort through the electorate with a set of individual assessments. And so they no longer have to say we're going to just put our resources in these precincts or just look at these demographic groups, but you can say, here are 3 people on a block that we want to mobilize. Here are 4 people on that same block that we want to persuade. We know that 3 of them we can persuade with our standard message about jobs and the economy. 1 of them will persuade with a message about guns. And campaigns can go out and develop what in effect amounts to a sort of unique prescription for interacting with each of them. And in the last decade, this has dramatically changed the way campaigns understand who they should be talking to. Then the question is, okay, we know a lot more about who they should be talking to. What do you do when you get there? And in that area, campaigns have been transformed by a series of innovations and research breakthroughs that have come not out of the commercial world, but out of academia. In 1998, 2 political scientists at Yale went out on the streets of New Haven before the midterm elections, and they ran a field experiment, which was a radical thing for political scientists to do. The discipline had always lagged behind the other social sciences in doing randomized experimentation for a number of reasons. A lot of them having their origins here at the University of Michigan, which is that massive investments were made in election studies and collecting survey data over the course of every 4 years, and it produced huge pools of data for anybody who wanted to try to understand what actually went on in campaigns. You could basically run regressions and look at the relationship between any population group and anything you wanted to measure in the polls, and there were seemingly infinite numbers of questions that you can answer that way. And so while economists started to realize that we could go out and actually try to test sort of people's behavior or responsiveness to certain types of interventions, and the real world political scientists were very reticent to do this. Nonprofit funding restrictions and human subjects review boards made it very difficult for political scientists to go out and get involved in partisan politics. And more to the point, political campaigns and parties wanted nothing to do with academics. And so the people who study campaigns lived often a very sort of cloistered life, detached from the campaigns that they thought that they were explaining. And so these two guys at Yale, Don Green and Alan Gerber, decided they were going to do an experiment mostly to address what were a bunch of sort of debates within their discipline over rational choice theory and over collective action problems. But the core of it was this question of why do people vote? And political scientists had been inclined towards a very sort of rational explanation that was often explained in these very long equations that basically presupposed that every registered voter before deciding whether or not to go cast a ballot on the morning of the election weighed the costs and benefits of doing it. The cost being all the time of learning about the candidates and making a decision among them, and going to the polls and waiting online. And the benefits were some estimation of the likelihood that their vote could be the pivotal one in tipping an election with tens, if not hundreds of millions of other people in a direction that would uniquely accrue material benefits to them. And, of course, the only way you can honestly make that calculation is if you were simultaneously judging how, in this case, 129 million other people will make those calculations, because otherwise you never know whether you're going to be the pivotal voter. And political scientists were pretty happy with the idea that when you decided whether or not to get in your car to go to, like, the elementary school in your neighborhood to cast a ballot, you were simultaneously refining these calculations for your personal use. These two guys at Yale thought that was a really silly way of thinking about human behavior. And so they decided that they were going to set up a test, and with the idea that if they could do anything to change somebody's likelihood of voting with a really small interaction, that they would call into question some of these big theories about how rational this decision is. And so they partnered with the local League of Women Voters chapter in Connecticut, and they randomly assigned New Haven voters to one of four treatment groups. And this was basically a randomized control trial like you'd set up a pharmaceutical trial. Except voters were the guinea pigs, and instead of randomly assigning drugs and placebos, you were going to randomly assign doses of political communication, then look at what it did to the people who got them. And so a quarter of the people got a get out the vote reminder on a postcard. A quarter of them got it from a phone call from a paid call center. A quarter got an in-person visit at the door from a canvasser, a paid grad student, and then there was a quarter that were in a control group. And after the election, you can go back and you can see who voted and who didn't. And it turns out that the people who got the phone call saw no increase in their likelihood of voting. The people who get the mail, there's a small but appreciable increase. The people that get the in-person visit see a significant jump in their turnout. And they try to get this paper published. Political science journals think it gets initially rejected from the American Political Science Review because they're told that it makes no meaningful contribution to any of the theoretical debates that are relevant to campaigns, or relevant to the study of elections. I think in the book I describe it as embarrassingly practical. And what you start to have is political professionals who, in my experience, very rarely pay much attention to what's going on in scholarly journals, take interest. And there tends to be one of two reactions. There's, oh, great, academics have developed a scientifically credible tool for disentangling cause and effect and empirically assessing the impact of methods that we convince candidates to spend tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars on every year. Or there's another reaction, which tends to be a little more widespread, which is, oh no, academics have developed a scientifically credible tool for determining whether the things that we get candidates to spend tens or hundreds of millions of dollars on every year actually work. And you get this sort of petty war in certain corners of the political consulting profession where the people who sell phone calls to campaigns start needing to defend themselves against the people who sell direct mail because they're sending this journal article around like it's Consumer Reports and they have two different dishwashers to hawk. But in that first group, you have a very small sort of cadre of people who not only say, oh, this is pretty neat, we should be paying attention to the specific findings from these experiments, but, and this is especially the case in a bunch of liberal interest groups that spend a lot of money year after year doing campaigns in Washington. Hey, we're out doing politics every year. We're sending mail and putting out phone calls and knocking on doors. Why don't we start running our own experiments to see what works? And over the first half of the last decade, you had a sort of new experiment-based research culture emerge in politics, some of it based in academia, some of it coming out of people who actually do elections in the real world, and at times interesting collaborations between the two. And over a few years, basically people test every combination of comparative effectiveness in individual voter contact that you can. So instead of just you go comparing mail to phone calls, then you do two pieces of mail versus one piece of mail. So the last piece of mail arrived the Thursday before the election or the Friday before the election. And does it work in Spanish? And does it work in Korean? And pretty soon, basically every permutation of this has been tested. And there's a sort of important moment that takes place in 2004, 2005 when a behavioral psychologist named Todd Rogers, who at the time is at Harvard, sort of stumbles onto the scene. And he had spent a little bit of time at a polling firm and had become frustrated by what he thought were the limitations of polling because it was reliant on people self-reporting or projecting their own future behavior, the sort of limitations of the inability of people to honestly project what they were going to do. And he sort of found solace in the literature from behavioral psychology, which he thought sort of got to some of the imperfections in how we assessed or predicted our own behavior. And at the time, he was volunteering for Wesley Clark's campaign in New Hampshire before the primary in late 2003 or late 2004. So he would drive up on the weekends from Cambridge, and he'd go to Clark's office in Manchester, and he'd see these scripts that were given to volunteers who would go out canvassing or make phone calls. And the scripts had this sort of standard bit of language that sort of came out of like the League of Women Voters, sort of culture of encouraging higher turnout, and felt particularly acute for Democrats after they had lost so narrowly in 2000 after the recount in Florida. And then would say something like, there are tens of millions of people who didn't exercise their right to vote in the last election. Don't be part of this problem of low civic participation. Go out and vote. And Rogers thought that made voting sound like a very sad, lonely thing that nobody wanted to do. And he knew that there was a pretty rich literature in behavioral psychology that showed that you could increase somebody's likelihood of doing something just by making it sound popular. And so he knew well a series of experiments that a psychologist named Bob Cialdini had run in the 1980s, where he worked with hotel chains that were very interested in getting people to reuse their towels. Now, hotels don't want to wash their towels every day because it they spend a lot of money on detergent, and it takes housekeeping longer to turn over a room. And so for years they had put like a placard in the bathroom that said something like, it wastes so many gallons of water every time you wash your towels. Don't be part of this ecological nightmare. Reuse your towels. And Cialdini designed an experiment where they randomly assigned some bathrooms to get a different placard that would go on the counter next to the sink, and it said something like, the majority of guests reuse their towels. Reuse your towels. And towel reuse went up just by giving people a different cue at this moment where they had a relatively low-cost decision to make, and you played to somebody's desire to sort of fit in with what they thought other people like and around them were doing. And so Rogers designed an experiment where ran a series of gubernatorial elections where they, in a nonpartisan get-out-the-vote program, voters were assigned to get one of two reminders, both of them accurate based on the same underlying set of facts, but more or less because of population growth, you can either make any election sound highly attended or ignored, right? And so one of these scripts would say something like more people, turnout in the last election for mayor of Ann Arbor was lower than in any other election in the city's history. Don't be part of this problem of low turnout, go vote. And the other one would say something like more people voted in the last election for mayor of Ann Arbor than any other election in the city's history. We expect big turnout next Tuesday, go out and vote. And turnout went up a few points, but people just got a different cue, this sort of so-called high turnout message. And it was a really important moment in understanding what motivated people to vote, because here was something that was demonstrated to turn non-voters into voters. And it didn't once mention the candidates, the parties, the issues, the policy concerns, the supposed stakes or consequences of the election. In fact, it didn't really have any conventional sort of political content to it. It wasn't about the candidates, it was more about the voter, and in this case, their desire to fit in and do something that was popular. And it opened up a sort of new vein of research in which people who were running these experiments started looking at things we knew from elsewhere in the behavioral sciences that had been demonstrated to change somebody's motivation to do something, not always something that they particularly wanted to do, often by changing the sort of social dynamics around it. And so the most successful thing we know for turning a non-voter into a voter was first demonstrated in an experiment in Michigan in 2006, in which those two professors at Yale, Don Green and Alan Gerber, partnered with Mark Grebner, who is a consultant who's based in East Lansing, who does direct mail and also happens to have built the first statewide voter file in Michigan, and some of you may know, which is a particularly arduous task in this state, given how decentralized election administration is. And their experiment, once again, assigned voters to get different types of mail. And one letter would say something like, Dear Elaine, your history as a voter is a publicly available document on file with the County Board of Elections. Here is your history as a voter. You did vote in last year's Senate election. You did not vote in the school board election. You did vote in the county commissioner primary. You did not vote in the governor's race. And here are your neighbors' vote histories. And it had other people on your block and whether or not they had voted in those same elections. And then there came a threat. There's another election coming up, and afterwards we'll send everybody an updated set. Now, this increased turnout among the people who received it by 20%. It also got Mark Grebner death threats. And both of those facts convinced the people who were behind the experiment that they were onto something pretty potent. And it was what psychologists called social pressure. In this case, it preyed, I think, on the expectation that people have, because we're in a country with a secret ballot, that your vote is, because your vote is private, that everything about voting is private. In fact, it's not. Who you vote for is private, but whether or not you vote is completely a public matter, and campaigns have been using it for forever to determine who's a voter and who isn't. And in this case, letting people know in a not particularly subtle way that their neighbors could become aware of this fact and that their neighbors could judge them on this fact was obviously a huge driver to get them to change their behavior. And once again, though, you were getting somebody to vote and you weren't talking to them about politics. You were talking to them about themselves and their desire to fit in, their desire to live up to whatever standards of good citizenship they may hold for themselves, their desire, in this case, not to be sort of outed as a bad citizen. And what you had in politics in the years after was, in many cases, some desire to figure out how to channel the power, the psychological power of this tool to not get the death threats, right? Because if you're an experimentally minded East Lansing direct mail vendor, you may be willing to put your name as the return address, but if you're a candidate or a party, you might not want to be the ones seen as doing the blackmail. And so there were sort of years of experiments, trial and error, almost all initially on the left, with academics and increasingly eventually involving the Democratic National Committee in 2010, trying to figure out how you can harness the sort of psychological potency of this idea of social pressure without the sort of backlash. And what in the end people realized was there's an experiment that the Democratic National Committee did in 2010 that informed a lot of what the Obama campaign did this year, where they realized that they could get some of that impact, not all of it, but by sending a letter, often on the letterhead of a respected local politician or civic figure that said something like, Dear Lynn, I can see that you voted in the 2008 elections, and I want to thank you for having taken the time to participate. There's another election coming up, and I hope that once again I can thank you for your good citizenship. And this once again increased turnout by a few points. It didn't seem to bring in any death threats, and that little bit of language. I was out in Ohio with canvassers from both campaigns the weekend before the election, and in the scripts that every canvasser would have is something that played to that language. I could see that you voted in the last elections, referring to people as voter or as the type of person who votes, all of which different experiments had established changed the sort of psychological dynamics around voting and made somebody more likely to respond. And so we've now concluded another election season in which I think the sort of full flower of these two innovations has become apparent. Campaigns have remarkable ability to individually target voters, now not only predicting your likely behavior and attitudes, but by combining those with experiments, having a surprisingly refined idea of how likely you are to respond to their efforts to persuade you or their efforts to mobilize you. And because of these sort of behavioral science-inspired experiments around motivation, I think a much more nuanced, honest understanding of how to make voting meaningful to people, and how to make the experience of voting a more social one. And so we still don't know exactly what turnout was this year, but we have seen since 1996, which was sort of a low point for turnout in presidential elections, it has increased every year since, and will probably end up somewhere right around where 2008 was nationally. And this has happened all during an era in which people are, I think, often rightfully cynical of their political leadership, are often depressed by what they see in Washington, probably feel a little bit hopeless that what they vote for will necessarily bring about whatever they want to see. People are less trusting of institutions, especially political and governmental ones. Our campaigns are often like petty and soul-crushing and superficial and depressing. And yet, more and more people are voting. And we saw this year people voting from demographic groups that traditionally have been voting at a higher rate from some demographic groups that are often the lowest participating, young people, minorities. And there has been, for all that I think the sort of pageant of campaigns and the sort of spectacle of governing in Washington has been frustrating, an awakening of a new type of civic culture around campaigns in the last decade. And I think too often we tell the story from the sort of perspective, and we've seen a sort of sequence of campaigns that are have a huge volunteer culture emerge around them, really focused on person-to-person contact, mostly face-to-face at doors, sometimes in phone calls. And we often tell this story from the perspective of the volunteers, right? So we look like the Dean campaign in 2003 and the Bush re-election in 2004, and I think these two Obama campaigns, and we say, well, volunteers were so excited because there's a charismatic candidate and there was this movement that started and they just wanted to give up their nights and weekends to go talk to their neighbors about this guy. And there's a little bit of truth in each of those cases, and I don't want to discount it. But we never fully tell that story from the perspective of campaigns, which is campaigns are investing in the infrastructure that makes a volunteer culture possible and it makes those type of person-to-person interactions with voters profitable because they understand that those are uniquely valuable interactions. And so they know from the sort of what we call micro-targeting, this individual level targeting, how better to assign who they should be sort of interacting with and how. And from these experiments, we know that there's something that goes on. We've seen sort of time after time that a door knock is more effective at turning somebody into a voter than a phone call. A phone call from a volunteer is more effective than a phone call from a paid call center. Even if somebody doesn't introduce themselves at the beginning of the call, voters apparently can hear the difference between a real person and somebody calling from Omaha. And we know that what campaigns now call chatty scripts, which is where the canvasser or the caller is asks questions so that there's an interaction, a back and forth between the questioner and the respondent, is more effective than what they call robotic scripts, where somebody just reads at you for 45 seconds. And so all of that is in the service of creating meaningful interactions among real people around campaigns. And we still don't have a great handle on what a TV ad does or a great debate performance does or a convention speech does in terms of public opinion. It's effectively impossible to design good ongoing experiments and isolate the effect of those really big things in mass media. But what we do know now, and what the smartest people in campaigns know now, is that something happens when a volunteer knocks on a door and talks to another voter that cannot in any way be replicated by any number of TV ads. And that's why the smartest campaigns aren't waiting for volunteers to just like come out of their doors and take initiative. They are creating the infrastructure of field offices and staffers to oversee them and to train volunteers so that when they go door to door, they're doing something that's actually turning non-voters into voters. I'll leave it there with the invitation that if you want to ask me blunt questions about 2012, we can transition neatly. So there's a microphone in the back of the room.
Yes, I want to clarify something you said.
Sure.
It was about the turnout. I thought the turnout in this election was significantly less. There were 10 million less Obama voters, 3 million less Romney voters than there were in the last election. Was that correct?
So there's a bit of a counting problem because there's a lot of votes that are still out. And the gap is certainly going to be smaller than we thought it was immediately after Election Day. So some of this was stuff in the Northeast where New York and New Jersey changed their, in very high population areas, changed their voting rules around Sandy. There's some totally unexplained problem with Arizona counting their ballots, but it sounds like at least 500,000 ballots out in Arizona, and then California has been incredibly slow. And part of the turn towards vote by mail or no-fault absentee ballot, but various all sorts of things where you can't count all the votes at 8 p.m. on election night mean that there are a bunch of states that I think in Colorado or Washington State, the window to even have your stuff get into the Board of Elections was still open until earlier this week. So I think that people rushed a little quickly to the assumption that turnout was going to be down a lot. Turnout might not get right up to the 129 or something million that voted in 2008, but I think what we'll see is it's probably going to be in the same ballpark, and that certainly, the increase from 2000 to 2004 to 2008, that I think the overall arc of that will remain intact, even if it doesn't get exactly there, but it's not going to be 15 million less.
Mark Krebner says hello. By the
Oh,
way.
great.
It seems almost, and maybe I haven't had a chance to dig behind the headlines and look at this yet, it almost seems like the Romney campaign left behind some science here. And I don't just mean on global warming and a lot of other things, but because they genuinely seem to be going with models that, and I don't know what they were based on, and where they expected a different complexion of the turnout than happened. And there was this massive amount of polling, which has been collectively pretty reliable. And they seem to go off on a tangent and say, well, we'll just assume a model of the 2012 turnout. And they actually seem to believe they were going to win based on that. did they go off the rails in following this parade towards greater reliance on actual tested techniques? Because they seem to make up their own this year.
Yeah. So I think the premise of your question is right. I mean, I think that at the core of this is there's a huge gap between the two parties on almost every matter of technique right now. And at the core of it is that I think that Democrats are not just synthesizing individual findings from specific experiments and using them to change their scripts and do a better job with individual level statistical models, but there's a sort of conception of what voting is that I think Democrats more fundamentally get out of this research than Republicans do. Let me step back. So, the basic way that campaigns historically have tried to determine who is likely to vote is you ask people. And so what are called likely voter screens. Gallup has the most baroque of them, which has 7 questions that are: how close are you following this election? How excited are you to vote? Do you know where your polling place is? Do you really know where your polling place is? Are you sure? But most people use some version of how close are you following this election? How excited are you to vote? And what you're basically measuring there is often what campaigns call enthusiasm. And so at the core of the Romney world, and it really wasn't just the Romney campaign, it was most people who were doing something on the right, whether on the super PAC side or in state races, was not just wishful thinking that this electorate would look more like 2010, but they looked at measures of enthusiasm that came through on polls, and they said Republicans are a lot more enthusiastic about voting than Democrats are. And by the traditional measures of the poll questions that asked that this was true, consistently for the last couple years. One thing that we realize is that people, when they're asked how likely they are to vote, first of all, are really bad at knowing in advance. And so I wrote at some point for Slate about some research that the firm Greenberg, Quinlan, Rosner, which is a Democratic polling firm, done work for the Clintons, did, where they do monthly polls for Democracy Corps, which is James Carville's vanity project, or James Carville is a vanity project, but apparently he gets people to fund one with special tax status. And so they go out and they do a sample of 1,000 people a month or something every month, and they put out a poll. And so at the end of 2008, Greenberg, Quinlan, Rosner went back and looked at the people that they had interviewed. Now, a big change that's taken place in polling in the last decade is that instead of, as was traditionally the case, you randomly dialed digits, you need to randomly, you want to randomly create a randomly assigned sample of people who are likely to vote. So you randomly dial numbers, then you ask people these questions to filter out people who look like a likely voter to you. What's changed in the last decade is now, because you have this huge database of voters and you have information about whether or not they voted in the past, which is a better prediction often of how they're going to vote. You can, campaigns will often call people, they'll decide who looks like a voter based on attributes, and they'll randomly pick respondents out of that sample. So Greenberg, Quinlan, Rosner would call people, so they knew who you were, even if they didn't get to the part of the poll where they asked you how old you are and your gender and where you live and all that stuff. And so but they would ask people, how likely are you to vote? And depending on your answer, you would either be allowed to continue with the rest of the survey or not. And they went back at the end of the year and they learned that, I'm going to get the numbers slightly wrong, but close enough, 87% of the people who said that they were very likely to vote had ended up voting. You go back and you look at the voter rolls. Something like 70% of people said that they would probably vote or whatever ended up voting. But 54% of the people who said that they were unlikely to vote had ended up voting. Now, there are a lot of good explanations for this. These people are polite. Instead of hanging up on the pollster, they offered a socially acceptable answer, which is, I'm not going to vote. And then you get kicked off the call, and you can go, they call somebody else, and you go on with your life. But maybe also these people had no idea in June what they would be doing on a Tuesday in November. And maybe they weren't that interested in the race in August, and they had no honest ability to foresee what they would be interested in November. And the one thing they definitely wouldn't know, even with all the self-awareness in the world, was all the things that campaigns would do to increase their likelihood of voting in September and October and in the first days of November, which is what we call mobilization. And all of these experiments have pointed to the idea that campaigns can do discrete things to increase an individual's likelihood of voting in very small ways, a point here, a point 2 points there, 3 points there. But I think at the core of the Romney campaign's assumptions about what the electorate would look like was that they don't really understand or believe in mobilization. So I was on the receiving end of, all the stuff that came out of the Romney press office and the RNC, where people would write stories that would say, hey, the Obama campaign has 130 offices in Ohio, the Romney campaign has, 40, 50 offices in Ohio, Obama has a better ground game. Now, which is these were stupid stories that had no texture. But the response of the Romney folks, the RNC folks would be, well, field offices don't vote. What does it matter how many offices you have? They just have a lot of offices. As though the Obama campaign went out just to find a lot of leases that they could sign to put in press releases, right? It's no, the Obama campaign opened offices because they had volunteer capacity that they wanted to fill or support, because they realized that there were things that volunteers could do that would increase the likelihood of getting their neighbors to vote. And that we have a huge body of empirical research that demonstrates how exactly you do this and what the impact is. And I think at the core of their skepticism wasn't just sort of spinning the idea of we don't have enough offices, but that they don't really get or believe that those interactions are things that change people's behavior. And so at the core of it,